The water dripped from Frank Miller's face, each drop landing on the polished kitchen floor with a tiny splash. Silence filled the room like a suffocating gas. His son Eric stood before him, empty glass still clutched in his hand, face twisted with contempt. No one moved, not Amanda, not the children, not Frank himself. The weight of the moment pressed down on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. "You've had enough food for today. You know how much groceries cost these days." The words hung in the air sharper than any knife. Frank slowly raised his hand to wipe his face. The gesture felt surreal, as if he were watching someone else perform it. Water soaked the collar of his blue cotton shirt, the one Martha had given him for his 60th birthday. He turned without a word and walked steadily toward his room, careful not to hurry, not to show how deeply the humiliation had cut. Behind him, he could feel Eric's eyes boring into his back, could sense Amanda's embarrassed gaze fixed on her plate, could imagine his grandchildren's confusion at witnessing their father treat their grandfather with such disdain. Inside his room, Frank gently closed the door and stood before the mirror hanging on the wall. Droplets still clung to his weathered face, tracking paths through the creases etched by 70 years of life. His eyes, once bright blue like the Boston Harbor on a clear day, now looked faded, tired. When had that happened? When had he become this old man, this burden, this object of contempt in his own family? "Is this what I deserve?" he whispered to his reflection. "After everything I've done, is this what I've earned?" The question echoed in the small room, unanswered, but stirring something deep within him, something that had been dormant for too long. Frank hadn't always been the frail figure his son now saw. Born in South Boston to working-class parents, he'd learned early about hardship and sacrifice. His father, a dock worker with calloused hands and a volatile temper, left when Frank was 10, disappearing one winter morning without so much as a goodbye. His mother, suddenly alone with 3 children to feed, had worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices downtown and waitressing on weekends. By 12, Frank was waking before dawn to help unload produce trucks at the local market before school. The older workers joked about child labor laws, but they slipped him extra dollars when the boy wasn't looking. "You're a good kid, Frankie," they'd say, "taking care of your mom like a real man." A real man. The phrase had meant something to him then. A goal to aspire to, an identity to claim. The hours were long, the work backbreaking, but Frank never complained. Each dollar he brought home meant one less worry line on his mother's forehead. Each early morning meant another lesson in responsibility, in perseverance. In high school, Frank worked evenings as a janitor at the same school he attended during the day. The humiliation of mopping floors his classmates had just walked across taught him to swallow his pride, to focus on the bigger picture. He graduated with decent grades despite his work schedule, not stellar enough for a scholarship, but enough to be proud of considering the circumstances. After graduation, he cycled through various jobs: construction worker, warehouse stockman, delivery driver, taking whatever paid the most, learning skills as he went. When he landed a position at a shipping company, he made it his mission to understand every aspect of the operation. Within 5 years, he'd worked his way up to floor manager. It was during these years that Frank met Maxwell Hendricks, the company's chief financial officer. Maxwell, a slender man with wire-rimmed glasses and immaculate suits, took an interest in the hard-working floor manager who stayed late reviewing inventory reports. "You've got a good head for business, Frank," Maxwell told him, one evening, finding him alone in the break room poring over budget spreadsheets. "But you'll never build real wealth with just a paycheck." Over the next few years, Maxwell became a mentor, teaching Frank about investments, compound interest, and the power of saving consistently. "A real man doesn't just earn money," Maxwell would say, tapping his temple with a slender finger. "He makes his money work for him." Frank absorbed these lessons eagerly. He opened his first investment account at 23, contributing a small but consistent amount from each paycheck. When others his age spent their bonuses on cars or vacations, Frank put his into dividend-paying stocks and municipal bonds. While not flashy, the strategy served him well, building a financial foundation, brick by methodical brick. At 25, Frank met Martha Sullivan at a friend's wedding. She was a kindergarten teacher with auburn hair and a laugh that made people turn to look. Their courtship was simple: walks along the harbor, picnics in the park evenings, at home listening to records. Martha didn't care about fancy restaurants or expensive gifts. She cared about reliability, about integrity, about the kind of man who would show up every day and mean what he said. On their wedding day, as they stood beneath the white arch at St. Catherine's Church, Frank made her a promise. Our children will never know the kind of struggle I did. They'll never worry about having enough food or warm clothes in winter. That's my vow to you, Martha, as important as any other I make today. She'd squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with tears and hope. Eric was born a year later, a healthy boy with his mother's green eyes and Frank's determined chin. Holding his son for the first time, Frank felt a fierce protectiveness unlike anything he'd experienced before. I'm going to give you everything, little man, he whispered. Everything I didn't have. And he tried. God, how he tried. Frank took overtime whenever it was offered, sometimes working 16-hour shifts at the logistics company where he'd continued to climb the ranks. When Eric needed special orthopedic shoes for his flat feet, Frank sold his prized collection of baseball cards accumulated since childhood. When the roof leaked during a particularly harsh winter, he learned to repair it himself rather than pay a contractor, working weekends in the bitter cold until his fingers were numb. He recalled skipping lunch for a week straight to save enough for Eric's first school uniform, a crisp blue blazer and gray slacks that made his son look like he belonged at the private Catholic school they'd struggled to afford. When Eric made the baseball team, Frank spent hours in the backyard practicing throws and catches, despite his aching back from long days at the warehouse. You're working yourself to death, Martha would warn, massaging his shoulders as he sat at the kitchen table reviewing bills late into the night. I'm investing in our future, he'd reply, in Eric's future. That had been his justification for everything. Every missed family dinner because of overtime, every vacation they couldn't take, every moment of exhaustion. It was all for Eric, all to ensure his son would have opportunities Frank never did. There was one memory that stood out vividly now as Frank stood in his bedroom, water still dripping from his chin. Eric, at 10 years old, standing in the driveway of their modest home as Frank's coworker dropped him off after work. His small chest puffed out with pride as he told his friends, "My dad is the strongest man in the world. He can lift 3 boxes at once at his job, and he fixes everything in our house without any help." The admiration in those young green eyes had been Frank's greatest reward, worth more than any promotion or bonus check. When had that admiration turned to disdain? When had my dad the hero become my dad the burden? The shift began during Eric's college years at Boston College, a dream Frank had worked multiple jobs to fund. Eric started bringing home friends from wealthy families, boys with trust funds in summer homes who looked around the Millers' modest 3-bedroom house with barely concealed condescension. Frank noticed how Eric would wince when he pulled up in his 10-year-old Chevy, how he'd quickly usher his friends inside before Frank could engage them in conversation with his embarrassing blue-collar perspectives. Martha had seen it too. "He's comparing our life to theirs," she'd said one night after Eric and his friends had gone out. "He's starting to be ashamed of where he comes from. He's just finding his way," Frank had defended. "It's natural to want to fit in." But Martha, always more perceptive about emotional currents, shook her head. "We're giving him too much without teaching him what it costs. He's losing perspective on what matters." Frank hadn't wanted to hear it. After a childhood of deprivation, he couldn't bear the thought of his son lacking anything. If that meant working harder to fund Eric's ski trips with his new friends, or buying him designer clothes so he wouldn't feel out of place, so be it. Martha's warnings about spoiling their son fell on deaf ears. "You can't buy his character, Frank," she'd say, a note of frustration creeping into her voice. "Some things have to be earned through struggle." "He deserves a better life than I had," Frank would insist. "What's the point of all my hard work if not to give him advantages?" There's a difference between advantages and entitlement, between giving him opportunities and giving him everything without him learning its value. Those conversations often ended in tense silence, with Frank retreating to his workshop in the garage to lose himself in some repair project, unwilling to admit that perhaps his wife's instincts were sharper than his own. When Eric graduated with his business degree and took a job at a prestigious real estate firm, Frank couldn't have been prouder. His son wore tailored suits, drove a nicer car than Frank had ever owned, and moved in circles Frank could never access. It seemed like proof that all the sacrifice had been worth it, until Eric met Amanda. Amanda Prescott came from the world Eric aspired to join, Private schools, family connections, a sense of entitlement so ingrained she probably didn't even recognize it as such. She was beautiful, ambitious, and completely unimpressed by how far Eric had come because she had no concept of where he'd started. The wedding was an extravagant affair at a country club Frank could barely afford, even after decades of careful saving. He emptied one of his investment accounts to pay for it, telling himself it was a worthy investment in his son's happiness. We could have had something smaller, Martha suggested when she saw the figures. Something within our means. This is within our means, Frank had insisted, though the numbers in their account told a different story. I've been saving for this day since he was born. What he didn't say was how he'd seen Eric's face light up when Amanda showed him the venue, how desperate he was to give his son this perfect day to prove he could provide a wedding worthy of the Prescott family's attendance. The morning of the wedding, as Frank adjusted his rented tuxedo in front of the mirror, Martha had come up behind him, placing her hands on his shoulders. I'm worried about you, she said, meeting his eyes in the reflection. About your need to prove something. I'm not proving anything. I'm celebrating my son. By spending money we don't have on people who won't remember it in a year. This isn't about Eric anymore, Frank. This is about your pride. The words stung because they contained a grain of truth he wasn't ready to acknowledge. After the wedding, when Eric and Amanda announced they'd found their dream home, a colonial with a 3-car garage in an exclusive neighborhood, Frank didn't hesitate to offer the down payment, though it meant withdrawing from his retirement fund and incurring penalties. You worked hard for that money, Martha protested. That was for our future, for when you can't work anymore. What better use for it than helping our son start his life right, Frank countered. Besides, I'll make it back. I'm not planning to retire anytime soon. Martha had given him a long look, worry etched in the fine lines around her eyes. There's helping Frank, and then there's enabling. I'm not sure you know the difference anymore. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps he'd crossed that line years ago, unable to distinguish between supporting his son and creating a sense of entitlement. The realization settled in his stomach like a stone as he stared at his reflection, water still dripping from his chin onto the carpet of the guest room that had become his sad little kingdom in Eric and Amanda's sprawling house. In a moment of foresight, Frank hadn't recognized at the time he'd made one decision Martha had fully supported, keeping his name as the primary account holder on all their investments and savings, with Eric and added only as a secondary user on certain accounts. They'd consulted with their longtime financial advisor, Richard Torres, who had gently suggested this arrangement just as a precaution. It's not about trust, Richard had explained, leaning forward in his leather office chair. It's about protection for both of you. Financial boundaries are healthy in any relationship, even between parent and child. Frank had agreed, though more to please Martha than out of any real concern. He'd never imagined needing protection from his own son. If you really want to help Eric, Richard had added, teach him financial independence, not dependence on your resources. But it was easier to sign a check than to have difficult conversations about money management, easier to bail Eric out than to let him face the consequences of his financial decisions. And so the pattern continued. Eric spending beyond his means, Frank stepping in to cover the gaps, all while telling himself it was temporary, that Eric would learn fiscal responsibility eventually. Then came the darkest day of Frank's life, the day he lost Martha to the breast cancer that had returned with a vengeance after 5 years in remission. The funeral was held on a rainy Tuesday, the drops pelting the black umbrellas like tiny accusations. Frank stood by the grave, hollow-eyed and disbelieving, while Eric managed the proceedings with efficient detachment. What Frank remembered most clearly from that horrible day wasn't the service or the meaningless platitudes from well-wishers. It was catching sight of Eric in a quiet moment, standing apart from the mourners, checking his watch, and then making a call that, from the snippets Frank overheard, appeared to be about Martha's life insurance policy. Not even a day had passed, and already Eric was calculating his inheritance. The weeks after Martha's death passed in a fog of grief. The house, once warmed by her presence, felt cavernous and cold. Frank found himself talking to her in empty rooms, setting 2 places at the dinner table, before catching himself reaching across the bed at night, only to encounter empty space. It was during this period of raw vulnerability that Eric suggested Frank sell the house and move in with him and Amanda. It's too big for you to maintain alone, Dad, he'd reasoned. You'd be doing us a favor, too. You could help with the kids when we're working late, and we'd know you're not all alone. The offer had seemed like a lifeline at the time, a chance to be useful, to be part of a family again, rather than rattling around his empty house with Martha's absence echoing in every room. Frank agreed, putting the family home on the market and transferring most of the proceeds into his investment accounts, with a substantial gift to Eric and Amanda to help with any renovations they might need to accommodate him. It wasn't long before Frank realized his mistake. The renovations turned out to be a pool installation that had nothing to do with his comfort. The promised family dinners became rare events where he sat silently while Eric and Amanda discussed people and events he knew nothing about. The grandchildren, initially excited to have their grandfather in residence, were increasingly busy with activities and friends. Worst of all were the small, daily humiliations. Amanda's pointed remarks about the food he ate. "That's going to raise your cholesterol, Frank." Eric's impatience when he needed a ride to doctor's appointments. "Can't you schedule these when I don't have meetings?" The way they both spoke about him as if he weren't in the room. "Dad's getting more forgetful lately." Frank contributed from his pension to household expenses, but Eric and Amanda acted as if they were doing him an enormous favor by letting him live under their roof. When Frank gently reminded Eric of his financial contributions, his son would change the subject or make vague acknowledgments that led nowhere. The only bright spot in this new arrangement was his granddaughter Lily, now 17, and possessing the same quiet perceptiveness that had characterized Martha. She noticed when Frank was excluded or dismissed and would make small gestures of inclusion, bringing him tea while he read in his room, asking about his day, when no one else bothered defending him, when her parents' comments became too barbed. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, where Eric had berated Frank for using too much hot water in his shower, Lily slipped into his room with a plate of cookies she'd hidden for him. "I'm sorry about Dad," she whispered, sitting on the edge of his bed. "He's not always like this. The pressure at work, the mortgage payments, but that doesn't excuse it." Frank patted her hand, touched by her kindness and troubled by her awareness. "It's not your burden to bear, sweetheart." "But it's not right," she insisted, her young face serious in the lamplight. "The way they treat you, like you're a problem to solve instead of a person to love." Those words stayed with Frank, echoing in his mind during sleepless nights. A problem to solve instead of a person to love. When had he become a problem in his son's eyes? When had all the love he'd poured into raising Eric evaporated into annoyance and contempt? The little indignities accumulated like snowflakes, each one insignificant on its own, but gradually building into an avalanche of disrespect. Eric interrupting whenever Frank spoke at family gatherings. Amanda sighing dramatically when Frank asked for help finding something. Both of them discussing his health and finances as if he were a child incapable of managing his own affairs. Frank began keeping a mental tally of the times Eric looked at his phone rather than making eye contact during their conversations, of the dinners where no one asked for his opinion or acknowledged his presence, of the family outings he learned about only through photographs posted after the fact. Each incident was a small wound, but the cumulative effect was devastating. "When you love someone too much, sometimes you can't see what's right in front of you," Frank murmured to himself, wiping the last of the water from his face. "Like those tiny drops of disrespect that eventually form an ocean of contempt." The incident that evening, Eric throwing water in his face for simply asking for more rice, wasn't an anomaly. It was merely the most visible manifestation of a pattern that had been developing for years. The public humiliation was new, but the underlying attitude was not. Frank's gaze fell on the small desk in the corner of his room where he kept his important papers in a locked drawer. With sudden clarity, he walked over and unlocked it, pulling out the folder containing his financial statements, legal documents, and the notebook where he tracked his expenses and contributions to Eric's household. For the first time in months, he reviewed everything methodically. The investment accounts he'd built over decades of disciplined saving, the retirement funds, the proceeds from selling the family home, the life insurance payout from Martha's policy. Despite his generosity toward Eric, he'd managed to preserve a substantial nest egg, enough to live comfortably independent of his son's charity. He also noted the debt Eric had accumulated, information he'd gathered from overheard conversations and glimpsed statements left carelessly on the kitchen counter. A second mortgage on the house, credit card balances that grew each month, a car lease they could barely afford. Eric and Amanda were living well beyond their means, counting on Frank's eventual passing to solve their financial problems. He threw water in my face. Frank whispered, the reality of it finally sinking in. My own son threw water in my face because I asked for food. Something shifted inside him. Not anger exactly, but a quiet, steely resolve. A recognition that he had allowed himself to be diminished, had confused self-sacrifice with self-erasure, had permitted his love to be exploited rather than appreciated. There is a kind of strength that comes from being underestimated. When they think you're weak, they never see the storm coming. Frank had lived 67 years, built a life from nothing, raised a family saved, prudently loved, deeply. He was not the frail, dependent old man his son perceived. He had simply forgotten his own power. I'm not a young man anymore, Frank said to the empty room. But I'm not finished either. I didn't build a life from the ground up just to be treated like this in my final chapter. He began to formulate a plan, not out of vengeance, but from a place of self-preservation and dignity. He would reclaim what he had given away too freely, his independence, his self-respect, and perhaps most importantly, the consequences of Eric's actions that he had too often absorbed. Frank had consulted with a lawyer months earlier, initially to ensure his affairs were in order following Martha's death. Gregory Schumer was the estate planning attorney who specialized in elder law, a thoughtful man in his 50s who had taken the time to explain every document in detail. Your primary concern seems to be providing for your son, Gregory had observed during their first meeting. Of course, Frank had replied. He's my only child. And what about your needs? Your protection? Have you considered what would happen if you became ill or needed long-term care? Frank had brushed off the concerns, then unable to imagine a scenario where Eric wouldn't look after his interests. How naive that assumption seemed, now sitting in a room that wasn't truly his, in a house where he wasn't truly welcome, with a son who saw him as nothing more than a wallet and an inconvenience. As the reality of his situation crystallized, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not since those early days of struggling to support his young family, of working multiple jobs to keep them afloat. It was a feeling of purpose, of clarity, of knowing exactly what needed to be done and finding the resolve to do it. He carefully returned the documents to the drawer, locked it, and placed the key in his pocket. Tomorrow would be a day of action. Tonight was for planning, for gathering his courage, for silently saying goodbye to the illusions he had maintained for too long. Money is just paper in the end, Frank reflected, running his fingers over the polished wood of the desk Martha had chosen for their first apartment. But what you use it to build, that's what matters. I thought I was building a family. I didn't realize I was constructing a prison for my own dignity, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. The water had dried on his face now, but its impact remained. A baptism of sorts, washing away the scales from his eyes and revealing the harsh truth he had refused to see. His son had thrown water in his face, and in doing so had unintentionally set him free. The Boston morning arrived with streaks of gold piercing through slate-colored clouds as Frank Miller stepped into the taxi he'd called. He wore his best suit, the navy one he'd purchased for Martha's funeral, and carried a leather portfolio containing the documents he'd organized the night before. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Where to this morning, sir?" Frank squared his shoulders. First National Bank on Tremont Street. The city passed by in a blur of movement and color, but Frank barely noticed. His mind was fixed on the task ahead, rehearsing what he would say, anticipating objections, calculating risks. The water incident had crystallized something within him. Not just anger, but clarity. Each mile the taxi covered felt like distance gained, not just from Eric's house, but from the person he'd allowed himself to become. At the bank, he was greeted by Susan Wilson, the branch manager, who had known him for nearly 30 years. Her professional smile faltered when she saw his face. "Frank, what happened to your arm?" She gestured toward a purplish bruise visible below his shirt sleeve. He hadn't intended to show, it hadn't even realized it was visible. The mark was from 3 days earlier, when Eric had grabbed him too roughly after Frank had accidentally knocked over a vase. "Just a little accident at home," he murmured, tugging his sleeve down. "Nothing to worry about." Susan's eyes narrowed slightly, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "What brings you in today? Your quarterly meeting with investments isn't until next month. I need to make some changes to my accounts." The steadiness in his voice surprised even him. "Significant changes." She led him to her private office, closing the door behind them. Frank opened his portfolio and laid out the statements for his various accounts, checking savings investments, retirement funds. Many of them had Eric listed as a secondary holder or beneficiary. I want to remove my son from all of these accounts, Frank stated flatly, and I want to transfer the balances to new accounts under my name only. Susan's professional mask slipped, revealing genuine concern. Frank, that's unusual. These are substantial assets. May I ask what prompted this decision? Frank hesitated, pride warring with honesty, but the bruise on his arm throbbed a reminder of what was at stake. My living situation has become untenable. I've been staying with Eric and his family since Martha passed, but it hasn't worked out as I'd hoped. The understatement felt like a stone in his throat. I need to secure my assets before making other arrangements. Susan leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering. Frank, I hope you don't mind me asking this, but is someone taking advantage of you financially or otherwise? The question hung in the air, direct yet delicate. Frank had known Susan since she was a teller fresh out of college. She'd helped him set up college funds for Eric, advised him on retirement planning, and attended Martha's funeral. They weren't friends exactly, but there was a relationship built on years of trust. My son believes he's entitled to everything I've worked for. Frank's voice remained steady, though the admission cost him dearly. He's waiting for me to die so he can claim what's left. Susan didn't look shocked. She'd seen such situations before, but her expression softened with compassion. I understand. Let's make sure that doesn't happen. Over the next 2 hours, they systematically secured Frank's finances. New accounts were created, funds transferred, automatic payments redirected, investment portfolios reconfigured. With each signature, each confirmation, Frank felt a peculiar mixture of sorrow and liberation. By noon, his financial life had been effectively divorced from Eric's. There's one more thing, Frank said, as Susan prepared the final paperwork. I'd like to see what transactions Eric has made on the joint accounts. She pulled up the records, and Frank's suspicions were confirmed. Numerous withdrawals, some quite large, made when Frank was at doctor's appointments or visiting old friends. Charges for luxury items Frank had never seen in the house. A pattern of financial exploitation so obvious, it made his chest ache with the dual pain of betrayal and self-recrimination. How had he been so blind? I suspected as much, he said quietly. May I have copies of these statements for my records? Susan printed everything, placing the papers in a folder. Frank, I don't typically do this, but have you spoken with a lawyer about elder abuse? The term landed like a slap. Elder abuse, is that what this was? The concept seemed foreign, something that happened to other people, neglected nursing home residents or confused dementia patients. Not to Frank Miller, who had run logistics for a shipping company, who had investments and a pension, who had raised a son and built a life through sheer determination. Yet the evidence was there. In the bruise on his arm, the financial records, the water thrown in his face, the daily humiliations, large and small. If it had happened to someone else, what would he call it? I have a lawyer, Frank acknowledged. I'll be seeing him next. Susan nodded, relief evident in her expression. Good. And Frank, you have my direct number. If you need anything at all, please call. We take financial exploitation very seriously here. Frank left the bank feeling lighter, as if he'd put down a heavy burden he'd been carrying too long. The financial ties that had bound him to Eric's manipulation were severed. Phase 1 complete. The taxi took him next to the law offices of Schumer and Associates, where Gregory Schumer welcomed him into a conference room with leather chairs and mahogany tables that spoke of stability and tradition. Frank, good to see you. Gregory extended his hand, his grip firm. Though I admit I was surprised by the urgency of your call. Frank placed his portfolio on the table, now thicker with the additional bank statements. I've had a change in circumstances. I need to update my estate plan. For the next hour, Frank outlined the situation. His deteriorating relationship with Eric, the financial exploitation, the verbal and physical intimidation, his decision to leave. Gregory listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. And last night, Frank concluded, he threw water in my face at the dinner table because I asked for more food, in front of his wife and children. Gregory set down his pen, his expression grave. Frank, I'll be blunt. What you're describing constitutes elder abuse. financial, emotional, and potentially physical. There are legal remedies available, including protective orders if necessary. Frank shook his head. I don't want to pursue that route, not yet anyway. What I want is to secure my future and send a clear message that I won't be mistreated or taken advantage of any longer. I understand. Gregory nodded. Let's start with revising your will and trust. They worked methodically through the documents, making significant changes to Frank's estate plan. Eric was removed as executor and primary beneficiary. Instead, the bulk of the estate would now go into a trust for Lily's education and future needs, with specific conditions requiring her to maintain good grades and complete college. A smaller trust was established for Eric, but with strict conditions. He would only receive funds after completing financial management courses and family counseling. The family home, which Frank had sold upon moving in with Eric, would remain in Frank's estate rather than being earmarked for Eric as previously arranged. These changes send a clear message, Gregory noted as they reviewed the final documents. But they only take effect after your passing. What about your immediate situation? Frank explained his plan to secure an apartment in a senior living community, one with security and support services. He had already made inquiries and had an appointment to view a unit the following day. That's a good start, Gregory agreed. But I'm concerned about potential retaliation when Eric discovers what you've done. Would you consider filing for a protective order? Frank hesitated. Not unless it becomes necessary. He's still my son, despite everything. Gregory's expression remained neutral, professional, but his eyes reflected understanding. In that case, I have another suggestion. I know Robert Parker. He's a former police officer who now runs an advocacy group for seniors facing abuse or exploitation. He might be able to offer practical support and resources. Frank accepted the referral, grateful for the connection to someone who might understand his situation without judgment. As he prepared to leave, Gregory asked one final question. Have you considered how you'll tell Eric about these changes? He's going to discover them eventually. The question gave Frank pause. He had focused so intently on implementing his plan that he hadn't fully considered the confrontation that would inevitably follow. I haven't decided yet, he admitted. Part of me wants to simply disappear, pack my things and leave while they're out of the house. Another part feels I should face him, directly explain my decisions. Gregory leaned back in his chair. There's no single right approach, but whatever you choose, make sure you're somewhere safe when he finds out. People can react unpredictably when money and pride are involved. Frank nodded, absorbing the advice. I'll be careful. As he left the law office, Frank checked his phone. 3 missed calls from Eric. A text message. Where are you? We need to talk about your behavior last night. His behavior, as if he had been the one to throw water, to humiliate, to demean. The audacity nearly took his breath away. He did not respond, instead directing the taxi to his next destination. The offices of the Senior Advocacy Network occupied a modest suite in a renovated factory building. The receptionist guided Frank to a meeting room where Robert Parker was waiting. Unlike the polished environments of the bank and law firm, this space had a utilitarian warmth. Comfortable but unpretentious furniture walls lined with resource materials, a coffee station in the corner. Robert Parker, a solid man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and alert eyes that missed nothing, stood to greet him. Mr. Miller, thanks for coming in. They settled at a small conference table, and Frank found himself sharing his story for the 3rd time that day. The repetition should have made it easier, but somehow each telling exposed new layers of pain and disillusionment. Unfortunately, Robert said when Frank finished, your situation isn't unique. We see this pattern frequently. Financial exploitation disguised as helping manage finances, isolation from friends or support networks, gradual erosion of independence and dignity. I never thought it would happen to me, Frank admitted. I always saw myself as capable, self-sufficient. That's exactly why many seniors don't report abuse. It challenges their self-image as independent adults, but being victimized doesn't make you weak, Miller. It makes the abuser wrong. Robert pulled out a file folder. Let me share some statistics that might put this in perspective. The numbers were staggering. Over 5 million elder abuse cases annually in the United States, with financial exploitation being the most common form. Even more disturbing, family members were the perpetrators in nearly 60% of reported cases. You're not alone, Robert emphasized. and reaching out for help is a sign of strength, not weakness. Frank absorbed this feeling, a complex blend of emotions, validation that his experience had a name and wasn't unique, sadness at the prevalence of such mistreatment, determination to address his own situation. "I've secured my finances and updated my legal documents," Frank explained. "Now I need a safe place to live and support, I suppose, for what comes next." Robert nodded approvingly. "You're already ahead of many people in similar situations. Let me tell you about some resources we offer." The Senior Advocacy Network provided various services: support groups, emergency housing assistance, connections to legal aid, and perhaps most valuable, an understanding community of peers who had faced similar challenges. "We have a weekly group that meets here on Thursdays," Robert mentioned. "Men and women who've experienced elder abuse or exploitation. Might be helpful to hear their stories, share your own if you're comfortable." Frank had never been one for support groups. He'd always handled problems privately, believing vulnerability was something to be managed rather than shared. But the isolation of recent months had taught him the limitations of self-reliance. "I'd like to try that," he said, surprising himself with his willingness. Robert smiled, a quick flash of approval. "Good. Now about housing, and you mentioned you're looking at senior communities." They discussed options with Robert, suggesting several facilities with good reputations and strong security protocols. He particularly recommended Riverside Gardens, a complex near the Charles River with independent living apartments and an active community life. "They have excellent security," Robert noted. "Card access, front desk, staff 24/7, cameras in common areas. If your son shows up uninvited, they can prevent him from entering." The practical consideration of security hadn't fully registered with Frank until that moment. Would Eric actually try to force his way in? The uncertainty itself was an answer. The fact that Frank couldn't confidently predict his son's reaction spoke volumes about how damaged their relationship had become. "I'm viewing a unit there tomorrow," Frank said. "If it seems suitable, I'll make arrangements immediately." As their meeting concluded, Robert gave Frank his card. "Call any time, day or night. We have staff on call for emergencies." Frank pocketed the card, touched by the offer of support from this stranger, who nevertheless seemed to understand exactly what he was facing. "When did helping older folks become your mission, if you don't mind my asking?" Robert's expression shifted, professionalism briefly giving way to something more personal. "My grandmother, she lived with my uncle's family after my grandfather died. We thought she was being cared for, but when I visited from college, I found her malnourished, her savings drained, sleeping on a mattress in the basement while they lived upstairs in the house she had paid off." His jaw tightened at the memory. "By the time I discovered what was happening, the damage was severe. I couldn't save her, but I could make sure others didn't suffer the same fate." The story hit Frank with unexpected force. The parallel to his own situation, the reminder of what could happen if he didn't take action. "I'm sorry about your grandmother. Thank you, but she's why I do this work." Robert extended his hand again. "And why I'm glad you came in today. Too many people in your situation never reach out." When the sky had turned from bright midday to the muted gold of afternoon, Frank found himself at a small cafe in a part of Boston where he was unlikely to encounter anyone who knew him. He ordered coffee and a sandwich, realizing he hadn't eaten all day. The simple act of choosing his own meal, paying with his own money, and eating without scrutiny felt like a forgotten luxury. He checked his phone again. 7 missed calls now, more text messages increasingly demanding, "Answer your phone." "Where have you taken the car?" "You're being childish." And finally, "We need to discuss your living arrangement. This isn't working." On that last point, at least, they agreed. Frank silenced the phone and returned it to his pocket, refusing to let Eric's demands intrude on this moment of peace. As he ate, he noticed an older woman at a nearby table, perhaps in her mid-60s, reading a book while she sipped tea. Something about her self-contained contentment, the evident pleasure she took in her solitude, struck him. After Martha died, he had feared being alone, had seen independence as synonymous with loneliness. But watching this stranger, he wondered if he had conflated two separate concepts. Perhaps one could be alone without being lonely. Perhaps independence could be a choice rather than a sentence. The woman glanced up, catching his gaze. Rather than looking away, embarrassed at being caught staring, Frank offered a small smile. She returned it, a moment of connection between strangers, before they both returned to their respective activities. The brief exchange left Frank feeling oddly hopeful. There was a world beyond Eric's house, beyond the narrow confines of dependency he had accepted. There were possibilities he had forgotten to consider. By late afternoon, Frank had completed his immediate tasks. His finances were secured, his legal documents, updated, his support network initiated. Only one major item remained on his agenda: finding a new home. He had an appointment at Riverside Gardens the following morning, but for tonight he needed temporary accommodation. He considered a hotel, but the thought of explaining to the front desk why an older man with no luggage needed a room seemed unnecessarily complicated. Instead, he called the one person he trusted implicitly. "Lily, it's your grandfather." His granddaughter's surprise was evident in her voice. "Grandpa, are you okay? Dad's been calling everywhere looking for you." "I'm fine, sweetheart, but I need to ask you something important, and I need you to keep it between us for now." He hesitated, aware of the position he was putting her in. "Can I trust you with that?" There was a pause, then Lily's voice came through resolute. "Of course, what do you need?" "I won't be coming back to the house tonight. Or possibly ever." Another silence, longer this time. When Lily spoke again, her voice was quieter. "Because of what Dad did. The water." That and many other things. Frank kept his tone gentle, mindful of the complexity of her position. "I found somewhere else to stay, but I need to collect some of my belongings. Do you know when your parents will be out of the house?" "They're going to the Sullivans' dinner party tonight. Leaving at 7, probably won't be back until 11 at least." Lily's voice had taken on a practical quality, as if she were helping plan a surprise party rather than her grandfather's exit from the family home. "I have debate team until 6, but I can come home after to help you." "No, that's not necessary. I don't want to put you in the middle any more than I already have." "I'm already in the middle, Grandpa." Her voice held a maturity beyond her 17 years. "And I want to help. Please." Frank relented, arranging to meet Lily at the house at 7:30 after Eric and Amanda had departed. As he ended the call, he felt both guilt for involving his granddaughter and immense gratitude for her loyalty. With several hours to fill before their meeting, Frank found himself drawn to a place he hadn't visited in months: the cemetery where Martha was buried. He paid the taxi driver extra to wait, then made his way through the quiet paths to the granite headstone bearing his wife's name. Frank had always felt self-conscious, talking aloud at gravesides, as if performing for an audience of other mourners. But today, with no one nearby to overhear, he found himself speaking to Martha as naturally as if she were sitting beside him. "I'm making changes, Martha. Big ones." He brushed some fallen leaves from the stone. "I think you'd approve, though you'd probably say I should have done it sooner." The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns across the grave. A gentle breeze stirred the remaining leaves, creating a hushed rustling that seemed like a response. "I kept thinking about what you said, that there's a difference between helping and enabling, between advantages and entitlement." Frank's voice caught. "You were right. You usually were about the important things." He told her everything: the incidents at Eric's house, his actions that day, his plans for the future. The one-sided conversation was cathartic, allowing him to process emotions he had suppressed throughout the day's practical activities. "I wish you were here to help me figure this out," he admitted finally. "But maybe this is something I need to do on my own, to prove to myself that I can." As the sun began to set, Frank said goodbye to Martha and returned to the waiting taxi. He felt different somehow, lighter, more resolved, as if the conversation had granted him permission to move forward with his plans. When the taxi turned onto Eric's street at precisely 7:30, Frank scanned the area carefully. Eric's BMW was gone from the driveway, confirming that he and Amanda had left for their dinner party. Only Lily's modest used Honda was visible, parked at the curb. Frank paid the driver and approached the house that had been his reluctant home for the past year. Despite having a key, he rang the doorbell. It no longer felt like he had the right to enter unannounced. Lily opened the door immediately, as if she'd been waiting just inside. Without a word, she pulled him into a fierce hug. Frank returned the embrace, suddenly aware of how little physical affection he had received since Martha's passing. The simple human contact, offered freely without obligation or ulterior motive, nearly undid his composure. "I was so worried," Lily murmured against his shoulder. "When Dad said you'd taken the car and disappeared." I'm sorry for worrying you, Frank said, stepping back to look at his granddaughter properly. But I needed to take care of some things without interruption. Lily nodded, her expression serious beyond her years. You're really leaving, aren't you? Yes. Frank saw no point in equivocation. I can't stay here anymore. I understand. She led him inside, closing the door behind them. I've already started gathering some of your things. I wasn't sure what you'd want to take. In Frank's room, several cardboard boxes sat on the bed, partially filled with clothes and personal items. The sight of his possessions being packed away, his life reduced to a few containers, struck him with unexpected force. This was really happening. He was severing ties with his only son, leaving behind the last vestiges of family life as he had known it. For a moment, doubt assailed him. Was he overreacting? Should he try one more conversation, one more attempt at reconciliation? But then he remembered. The water in his face, the bruise on his arm, the financial exploitation, the daily humiliations. No, this wasn't an overreaction. This was long overdue. Thank you for starting this, he told Lily, moving toward the closet to continue the packing. They worked together efficiently, Lily helping him sort through his belongings, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. Frank focused on essentials and items with sentimental value. Clothes, toiletries, those photographs, Martha's wedding ring, which he kept in a small velvet box, the watch his colleagues had given him at retirement. What will you tell them? Frank asked as they filled the last box. Your parents when they find out you helped me. Lily considered this, folding a sweater with methodical precision. The truth, that I love you and I want you to be safe and happy, and that what's been happening in this house isn't right. The simple declaration of love delivered without fanfare affected Frank deeply. In the midst of severing one family bond, he was reminded of the strength of another. You are very much like your grandmother, he said softly. She had the same moral clarity, the same courage to speak uncomfortable truths. Lily smiled at the comparison. I wish I'd known her better. She would have been incredibly proud of the young woman you've become. Frank closed the final box. Just as I am. With the packing complete, they carried the boxes to the garage where Eric's seldom-used station wagon was parked. Frank had deliberately taken the keys that morning, knowing he would need transportation for his belongings. They loaded everything into the trunk and back seat. Where will you go tonight? Lily asked, concern evident in her voice. A hotel just for tonight. Tomorrow I'm looking at an apartment in a senior community. Frank hesitated, then added, I'll give you the address once I'm settled, but I'd like you to keep it to yourself for now, at least until things calm down with your father. Of course. Lily bit her lip, then asked the question that was clearly troubling her. Will I still see you? Absolutely. Frank's response was immediate and emphatic. This change is between your father and me. It doesn't affect my relationship with you in any way. We'll figure out how to stay connected. Relief washed over Lily's features. Good, because I'm not ready to lose my grandfather. The simple honesty of her statement touched him deeply. You won't lose me, Lily. I promise. As Frank prepared to leave, Lily handed him an envelope. I almost forgot. This came for you today. It looks important. Frank glanced at the return address, his life insurance company. He tucked it into his jacket pocket to review later. One more thing, Lily said, pulling out her phone. Let me give you my direct number, not the house line, so we can stay in touch. They exchanged numbers, and Frank embraced his granddaughter one final time. Thank you, Lily, not just for tonight, but for everything, for seeing me when others look past me. Just be safe, Grandpa, she whispered, and let me know where you end up. As Frank pulled out of the driveway, he caught a glimpse of Lily in the rearview mirror, standing in the garage doorway, her slender figure illuminated by the interior light. She raised her hand in farewell, and he honked once in response, a subdued goodbye to match the gravity of the moment. Driving through the darkening streets, Frank experienced a surge of contradictory emotions. Grief for what was lost, relief at his escape anxiety about the future, pride in his reclaimed autonomy. He had spent decades defining himself primarily as a father, orienting his life around Eric's needs and wants. Who would he be now? What would shape his days, give meaning to his choices? The questions had no immediate answers, but for the first time in months, perhaps years, Frank felt equipped to face them. He had taken decisive action, had refused to accept mistreatment, had asserted his worth as something independent of his role as father or provider. At a red light, Frank opened the envelope Lily had given him. Inside was a standard communication from his life insurance company. A notice that his policy premium had increased slightly due to age-based adjustments. Nothing urgent or particularly significant, except for one detail that caught his attention. Eric was still listed as the sole beneficiary. Frank made a mental note to change this tomorrow to align his insurance with the other modifications he'd made to his estate plan. The oversight was minor but symbolic of how completely he had once centered his financial life around providing for his son, even at his own expense. The hotel Frank had chosen was modest but clean, located in a quiet neighborhood near Riverside Gardens, the senior community he would visit tomorrow. After checking in and bringing his essential overnight items to the room, he sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly aware of the profound silence around him. No sounds of Eric and Amanda's television shows bleeding through the walls. No footsteps overhead. No muffled conversations in which he caught his name mentioned with exasperation or dismissal. Just silence. Neutral, neither comforting nor threatening, simply there. Frank reached for his phone, finding it full of increasingly agitated messages from Eric. The most recent, sent just 30 minutes ago, contained an unmistakable threat. "If you've taken the station wagon, that's theft. I'll call the police if it's not back by midnight." The threat might have intimidated Frank yesterday, might have sent him hurrying back to avoid conflict. But today, with his finances secured and his plans in motion, he viewed it with detached clarity. The station wagon, like the house, had been purchased with funds from the sale of the family home, funds that rightfully belonged to Frank. Eric had no legal claim to the vehicle, a fact he likely knew, but hoped Frank didn't. Rather than responding to the threat, Frank composed a brief, factual text message. "I'm safe. I've moved out. I'll be in touch when I'm ready to discuss things further. Please respect my decision." He pressed send, then immediately silenced the phone, knowing Eric's response would be immediate and hostile. That conversation could wait for another day, when Frank was fully settled and better prepared for the confrontation that would inevitably come. For now, he needed rest. The day had been emotionally and physically taxing, perhaps the most consequential day of his life since Martha's death. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, the continuing work of rebuilding his life on terms he defined. As Frank prepared for bed in the unfamiliar room, he was struck by a realization that seemed both obvious and profound. This was the first night in over a year that he was answerable to no one but himself. No one would question his bedtime routine, comment on his medication schedule, sigh impatiently if he took too long in the bathroom. The freedom felt foreign, almost dizzying after months of constant scrutiny and judgment. "When love is used as a leash," Frank murmured to himself as he turned out the light, "it becomes something else entirely. I confuse sacrifice with submission, giving with surrendering. Never again." The hotel bed was firmer than he preferred, the room temperature slightly too cool, the ambient noise of the building unfamiliar. Yet Frank fell asleep more quickly and deeply than he had in months, his body and mind finally releasing the tension of perpetual vigilance, the exhausting effort of trying to be small enough, quiet enough, invisible enough to avoid criticism or contempt. For the first time since moving into Eric's house, Frank slept without dreams of drowning, of being slowly erased, of calling out for help that never came. Instead, he dreamed of open roads, of spacious rooms filled with light, of conversations where his voice was heard and his words held weight. He dreamed of liberation. Dawn spread its golden fingers across the Boston skyline as Frank awoke in his hotel room. For a moment, disorientation gripped him. The unfamiliar ceiling, the muffled sounds of other guests in the hallway. Then memory flooded back. This wasn't a temporary arrangement. This was the first morning of his new life. He checked his phone. 23 missed calls from Eric. Voicemails filled with escalating anger accusations, and finally a tone of panicked disbelief. Text messages that evolved from demanding to threatening to plaintive. Frank listened to just enough to confirm what he had expected. Eric had discovered the financial changes. The last voicemail, left at 3:47 a.m., contained a broken quality Frank had never heard in his son's voice before. "What have you done? Everything's gone. The accounts, the access, everything. Call me, please." Frank set the phone aside, neither responding nor deleting the messages. They would serve as documentation if needed later. He wouldn't engage with Eric's chaos today. He had an appointment to keep. Riverside Gardens sat on a gentle slope overlooking the Charles River, its brick buildings arranged in a horseshoe around meticulously maintained gardens. The community presented an immediate sense of dignity, not ostentatious but well-kept and thoughtfully designed. Security cameras monitored the entrances discreetly, and the front desk was staffed by a retired police officer named Hank, who took his role as gatekeeper seriously. "We maintain residents' privacy," Hank explained as he gave Frank a tour of the security systems. "No one enters without being on an approved visitor list or accompanied by a resident." Frank nodded, relief washing through him. "That's very reassuring." The available apartment exceeded Frank's expectations. A one-bedroom unit on the third floor with a small balcony overlooking the river. The space was modest but efficiently designed with wide doorways to accommodate mobility aids if needed in the future, an emergency call system, and updated appliances. Most importantly, it felt nothing like Eric's house. No memories here, no echoes of humiliation, just neutral space waiting to become whatever Frank chose to make of it. The monthly fee includes all utilities, weekly housekeeping, and access to the community center, the property manager explained. "We have an excellent meal plan option as well, though each apartment has a full kitchen if you prefer to cook for yourself." Frank walked to the balcony, watching the sunlight dance across the river's surface. The scene stirred something in him, a sense of possibility, of peace. He had spent too long in confined spaces, both literally and metaphorically. This place offered room to breathe. "I'd like to take it," he said, turning back to the manager, "as soon as possible." Paperwork was completed efficiently. A security deposit was paid from Frank's newly secured accounts. Keys were handed over. By noon, Frank Miller had a new home, one where his name was the only one on the lease, where he controlled who could enter, where dignity wasn't a luxury, but a baseline expectation. "You can move in as early as tomorrow," the manager said as they concluded the arrangements. "We'll have the unit professionally cleaned today." Frank thanked her and headed back to his hotel, his step lighter than it had been in months. He had one more night of transition, and then he could begin settling into a space that was truly his own. The relief was so profound it bordered on euphoria. That afternoon, Frank visited a furniture store, purchasing essentials for his new apartment: a comfortable bed, a reading chair, a small dining table. He arranged for delivery the following day, using his own credit card, making decisions based solely on his own preferences without considering anyone else's approval. Each selection felt like a small reclamation of self. At the store's electronics section, Frank purchased a new mobile phone with a new number. He would keep his old phone temporarily to document Eric's communications, but for everyday use, he needed a number his son couldn't flood with demands. He would share the new number only with selected people: Lily, his lawyer; Susan at the bank; Robert from Senior Advocacy Network. Back at the hotel, Frank began making lists: things to buy for the apartment, services to arrange, people to contact. The systematic planning soothed him, providing structure amid transition. He was good at logistics, at organizing efficient systems. These skills that had served him in his professional life would now help him rebuild his personal one. When evening arrived, Frank felt a familiar pang of loneliness, a sensation that had been his constant companion since Martha's death. But tonight, the feeling carried a different quality. This wasn't the loneliness of isolation within a hostile household. This was simply being alone, a neutral state that contained its own possibilities. Frank remembered the woman at the cafe contentedly reading by herself. Perhaps solitude could be cultivated, could become comfortable rather than desolate. Perhaps there was a difference between being lonely and being alone. His phone rang, the screen displaying Lily's number. Frank answered immediately. "Grandpa, are you okay?" Worry threaded through her voice. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Better than fine, actually. I've found an apartment, a nice place overlooking the river. I'm moving in tomorrow." Lily's relief was audible. "Thank goodness. Well, it's been intense here. He came home early from the dinner party and found your room partly emptied. Then this morning he was on the phone with banks shouting about accounts being closed." Frank winced, imagining the scene. "I'm sorry you're caught in the middle of this." "Don't apologize. You did what you had to do." A hesitation then. "He wants your new address. He's been asking me if I know where you are. And what did you tell him? That I helped you pack but don't know where you went. It's technically true, or was until now. Frank appreciated her careful navigation of a difficult situation. I'll give you the address, but I'd like to get settled first before sharing it with your father. Can you hold off a bit longer? Of course. Another pause. Mom thinks you should come back and talk things through. She says families should work out problems together. Frank considered Amanda's sudden interest in family reconciliation. I imagine she's particularly concerned about the financial adjustments I've made. Yeah, she keeps mentioning something about accounts and agreements. I don't really understand all of it. You don't need to understand it. This is between your father and me. Frank shifted topics, not wanting to burden Lily with adult conflicts. How's your debate team doing? You had a meeting yesterday, right? They spoke for several more minutes about Lily's activities, her college applications, her hopes for the future. The conversation flowed easily, reminding Frank that despite the rupture with Eric, his relationship with his granddaughter remained intact, perhaps even stronger for the honesty they now shared. After they said goodbye, Frank sat with his thoughts processing the information Lily had shared. Eric's reaction was as expected, anger followed by panic as the implications of financial separation sank in. Amanda's push for family reconciliation was transparent self-interest. She had never shown concern for Frank's well-being before. None of it surprised him, yet he felt an unexpected emotion stirring beneath his practical assessments. Sadness. Not regret, he remained certain of his decisions, but sadness for what had been lost for the relationship with his son that had curdled into exploitation and contempt. When had it happened? Had there been a pivotal moment he had missed an opportunity to correct course before things deteriorated so completely? Or had the seeds been planted decades ago when he confused providing material comforts with teaching values? Questions without answers circled his mind as night descended. Tomorrow would bring the tangible tasks of moving, setting up his new home, establishing new routines. But tonight, in the liminal space between his old life and his new one, Frank allowed himself to acknowledge the grief beneath his determination. The morning brought renewed purpose. Frank checked out of the hotel and drove to Riverside Gardens, where the station wagon would remain in the secure residence parking area. The majority of his belongings would be delivered later from the storage unit he'd rented, but he carried a small suitcase containing immediate necessities. Hank greeted him at the front desk, officially registering him as a resident and providing an electronic key card that would access both the building's main entrance and his apartment. Welcome to Riverside, Mr. Miller. If there's anything you need help with, just let us know. The apartment felt different now that it was officially his, no longer a possibility, but a reality. Frank moved through the space, slowly absorbing its dimensions, considering how to arrange his belongings, imagining daily routines. The emptiness held promise rather than desolation. Furniture deliveries began arriving mid-morning. The bed frame and mattress, the reading chair positioned by the balcony door to catch the afternoon light, the small dining table placed near the kitchen. Each item transformed the generic apartment into something more personal, more his. By afternoon, the essential framework of a home had taken shape. The spaces remained Spartan, no artwork on the walls, yet minimal decorative elements, but functional and comfortable. Frank stood in the center of the living room, taking stock of what he had accomplished in just 24 hours. From financial captivity to independence, from subjugation to self-determination. A knock at the door interrupted his reflections. Frank tensed momentarily. Could Eric have found him already before remembering the building's security protocols? He opened the door to find a woman approximately his age holding a small potted plant. Welcome to the third floor, she said, offering the plant. I'm Patricia Delaney, your neighbor from 307. Frank accepted the plant, a small peace lily, with genuine pleasure at the unexpected gesture. Frank Miller, thank you for the welcome. I noticed the furniture deliveries, Patricia explained. The first day in a new place can be overwhelming. I thought you might like something living to keep you company while you settle in. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Frank deeply. After months of being treated as a burden, as a problem to be managed, this simple acknowledgement of his humanity, of his need for beauty and connection, felt profoundly restorative. Patricia didn't linger, seeming to intuit that Frank might need space more than conversation at this point. The community has a coffee hour on Thursday mornings in the main lounge. Low-pressure way to meet people if you're interested. After she left, Frank placed the peace lily on the windowsill where it would catch good light. The small addition transformed the apartment, subtly adding life to the clean but impersonal space. A reminder that growth was still possible even after difficult transplanting. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of practical activities, unpacking clothes, arranging the few personal items he had brought, setting up utilities and services. By evening, Frank felt simultaneously exhausted and invigorated. The physical fatigue of moving was counterbalanced by the psychological liberation of claiming his own space. As sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Frank sat on his small balcony, watching the colors reflect on the river's surface. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he felt fully present in the moment, not anxiously anticipating criticism, not rehashing past humiliations, just experiencing the beauty before him without distraction. His phone chimed with a text message from Lily. "Hope moving day went well. Love you, Grandpa." On the simple message warmed him. Not all family bonds had been severed. Some remained, perhaps growing stronger through adversity. Frank slept deeply that night in his new bed in his new home. The ambient sounds were still unfamiliar. Different water pipes, different heating system, different neighbors, but they didn't disturb his rest. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt safe. Thursday morning brought another development. Frank had just finished breakfast when his phone rang. His new phone, which meant the caller was someone he had chosen to stay connected with. The screen displayed Robert Parker's name. "Frank, hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to check how you're settling in at Riverside." Frank assured him that the move had gone smoothly and that he was adjusting well to his new environment. "Glad to hear it. The reason I'm calling, we have a support group meeting today at 2 p.m. I mentioned it when we met, but I wanted to extend a personal invitation. First meetings can be intimidating, but I think you might find it valuable." Frank hesitated. He had agreed to try the group during their previous conversation, but now that the moment had arrived, his natural reticence reasserted itself. Discussing personal matters with strangers went against his generational inclinations toward privacy and self-sufficiency. "I understand if you're not ready," Robert continued, seeming to sense Frank's hesitation. "No pressure. The group is there when and if you want to participate." Something in Robert's approach, the respect for Frank's agency, the absence of pressure, helped make the decision. "No, I'd like to come. You're right that it's intimidating, but I think it might be helpful." The Senior Advocacy Network offices looked the same as during Frank's previous visit, but his perception of the space had shifted. Previously, he had been in crisis mode, seeking immediate assistance. Today, he arrived as someone who had taken decisive action, who had already begun rebuilding his life. Robert greeted him warmly, leading him to a meeting room where several older adults were gathering. "Everyone, I'd like to introduce Frank Miller. Frank, this is our Thursday group." The circle included 5 other seniors, 3 women and 2 men, ranging in age from early 60s to late 70s. They welcomed Frank without overwhelming him, each introducing themselves briefly before the session formally began. Dorothy, a silver-haired woman with intelligent eyes, in a forthright manner, spoke first after the introductions. "Since we have a new member, perhaps we should share a bit of our stories." She described how her daughter and son-in-law had gradually taken control of her finances after her husband's death, eventually selling her house without proper consent and moving her into a small apartment while they used her money to renovate their own home. "I felt so foolish when I finally realized what was happening. How could I have been so blind?" The others shared similar experiences: financial exploitation by adult children, emotional manipulation by caregivers, isolation tactics by family members who wanted control of assets. The details varied, but the patterns were strikingly similar, and so were the emotions: shame, disbelief, grief over betrayal by loved ones. When it came Frank's turn, he found himself speaking more freely than anticipated. The shared experiences created a context where his story wasn't unique or shocking, just another variation on a sadly common theme. "The water in my face was just the final straw," he explained. "Looking back, I can see 100 warning signs I ignored because I couldn't believe my son would treat me that way." Heads nodded around the circle. No one offered platitudes or easy solutions. No one suggested that Frank should reconcile for the sake of family harmony. Instead, they offered understanding based on lived experience, practical suggestions for navigating the aftermath, and above all, validation that he had done the right thing by protecting himself. Dignity isn't negotiable, said George, a former high school principal, whose son had systematically isolated him from friends and community. That's what took me too long to realize. You can compromise on a lot of things in life, but once you start compromising your basic dignity, there's no bottom to that pit. By the session's end, Frank felt a weight lifting that he hadn't fully acknowledged was there. The burden of wondering if he had overreacted, if he should have tried harder to salvage the relationship with Eric. The group's collective experience confirmed what his instincts had told him: he had made the necessary choice for his own survival. As people began dispersing, Dorothy approached Frank. "First meetings are tough. How are you holding up?" "Better than I expected," Frank admitted. "It helps to know I'm not alone in this experience." "None of us are alone, though it certainly feels that way at first." Dorothy studied him thoughtfully. "You know what surprised me most when I finally took back control of my life, discovering how many interests and talents I had neglected while trying to maintain a relationship that was killing me by inches." Her words resonated deeply with Frank. How many aspects of himself had he suppressed to avoid conflict with Eric and Amanda? How many preferences had he abandoned? How many opinions had he silenced? How many pleasures had he denied himself to minimize their contempt? "I used to play chess," he said, the memory surfacing unexpectedly. "Tournament level years ago. Martha and I would play most evenings after dinner. I haven't touched a board since she died." "Riverside has a chess club," Dorothy mentioned. "Tuesdays and Fridays in the community room. You should check it out." The suggestion was casual, but it triggered something significant in Frank's thinking. His focus had been on what he was leaving behind: the toxic relationship with Eric, the financial exploitation, the daily humiliations. He hadn't fully considered what he might be moving toward, what he might reclaim or discover about himself in this new chapter. After the meeting, Frank stopped at a bookstore, purchasing a book on chess strategy to refresh his skills. The simple act felt revolutionary, buying something purely for personal enjoyment without considering anyone else's approval or disapproval. As days passed, Frank established new routines in his apartment at Riverside. Mornings began with coffee on the balcony, watching the river's changing moods. Afternoons often included walks along the Riverside path or visits to the community's small library. Evenings found him reading, watching documentaries, or practicing chess openings at his dining table. He joined the chess club, discovering that while his skills were rusty, the fundamental patterns remained embedded in his memory. The Tuesday and Friday sessions became highlights of his week, providing both intellectual stimulation and social connection without pressure. Patricia from next door proved to be good company. Intelligent, independent, with a dry wit that reminded Frank of Martha's sense of humor. They occasionally shared morning coffee on their respective balconies, the conversation flowing easily across the small space separating the two units. "My husband never understood why I needed my own interests," Patricia remarked one morning. "He took it personally when I joined a book club or took a class, as if having my own intellectual life somehow diminished our marriage." Frank nodded, recognizing the pattern. Martha was the opposite. She insisted we each maintain separate hobbies alongside our shared ones, said it kept us interesting to each other. "Smart woman, your Martha." Patricia sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Too many people think love means merging into one entity, losing all boundaries. But real love requires two whole people, don't you think?" The observation lingered with Frank throughout the day. Had that been his fundamental mistake with Eric, allowing his identity to be so completely subsumed by his role as provider that he had effectively erased himself? Had he modeled an unhealthy obliteration of boundaries that his son had internalized as normal? 3 weeks into his new life, Frank received a letter forwarded by his lawyer, a formal communication from Eric demanding the return of stolen property, the station wagon, and threatening legal action. Gregory Schumer called to discuss the letter. "It's an empty threat," Gregory assured him. "The vehicle was purchased with your funds. We have documentation establishing your ownership. This is just intimidation." Frank agreed, seeing the letter for what it was: another attempt to exert control to punish him for his independence. "Should I respond?" "I'll send a brief factual response on your behalf asserting your ownership and rejecting the accusation of theft. Beyond that, engaging further just feeds the dynamic. The incident, though unpleasant, affirmed Frank's decision to maintain distance from his son. Eric's focus remained entirely on material concerns, the car, the bank accounts, with no acknowledgement of the mistreatment that had precipitated Frank's departure. No apology for throwing water in his face for the daily humiliations for treating him as a burden rather than a father. Through Lily, Frank learned that Eric and Amanda were facing significant financial difficulties. The lifestyle they had maintained was largely dependent on access to Frank's resources, and without that support, they were struggling to meet mortgage payments and maintain their standard of living. Eric had been forced to sell his luxury car, and Amanda had reduced her work hours to eliminate childcare costs. Dad won't admit it, Lily reported during one of her visits to Frank's apartment. But he's panicking. They're talking about putting the house on the market and downsizing. Frank absorbed this information without the satisfaction Eric might have expected him to feel. There was no pleasure in his son's difficulties, only sadness that it had come to this, that material concerns had so completely corrupted what should have been the most basic human connection. Your father built his life on a foundation he didn't own, Frank said carefully. That's not sustainable for anyone. Lily nodded, perceptive beyond her years. I've been thinking a lot about what you said before, about dignity being non-negotiable. I've been watching how my friends' parents treat their own parents, how different families handle things. There's respect in some households that was missing in ours. The observation impressed Frank with its insight. You'll carry that awareness into your own relationships. That's something valuable, even if it came through a difficult situation. Their visits became a regular fixture. Sunday afternoons spent playing chess. Lily was learning, showing a natural aptitude for strategy, walking by the river, or simply talking. These hours restored a sense of family continuity that had been fractured but not destroyed by the break with Eric. As spring arrived, bringing renewed life to the Riverside Gardens, Frank received an unexpected phone call from Robert Parker. I have a request, Robert began after the initial greetings. We're organizing a panel discussion at a conference on elder abuse prevention, primarily for professionals, social workers, healthcare providers, law enforcement. Would you consider sharing your experience? Your story could help train people to recognize warning signs, understand the complex dynamics involved. The request gave Frank pause. Speaking publicly about such personal matters went against his natural inclinations. Yet he also recognized the potential value. If his experience could help others avoid similar situations or help professionals intervene more effectively, wasn't that worth the discomfort of disclosure? What exactly would it involve? He asked, neither accepting nor declining immediately. Robert explained the format, a moderated panel discussion where several survivors of elder abuse would share their experiences, followed by questions from the audience of professionals. Participants could choose what details to share or withhold, maintaining whatever level of privacy felt appropriate. I'll need to think about it, Frank said honestly. Can I let you know next week? Of course, no pressure either way. It's entirely your decision. Frank appreciated that Robert consistently honored his agency, never using guilt or obligation to influence his choices. After the call, he walked to the river's edge, finding a bench where he could sit and process the request. Public speaking had never been his strength, but this wasn't about oratorical skills. It was about whether he was ready to claim his experience fully, to speak it aloud, not just in the safety of a support group, but in a professional setting where his story would be analyzed, discussed, perhaps even documented. The water flowed steadily before him, constant yet ever-changing. 6 months ago, he had been trapped in a situation that was slowly crushing his spirit. Now he sat in the spring sunshine, independent, secure, reconnected with parts of himself he had nearly lost. The transformation was profound, worth acknowledging, worth sharing if it might help others. That evening, Frank called Patricia from next door, inviting her for coffee in the community lounge. Their friendship had deepened over the months, evolving from neighborly politeness to genuine connection. He valued her perspective and wanted her input on Robert's request. I think you should do it, she said after listening carefully to the situation. Not for them, but for yourself. There's power in telling your own story in your own words on your own terms. Frank considered this. I worry about exposing Eric publicly. Despite everything, he's still my son. Patricia nodded, understanding the complexity. You don't have to use real names or specific details that would identify him. The valuable part is the pattern, how seemingly small disrespects escalate, how financial control becomes a weapon. Her framing helped clarify his thinking. This wasn't about retribution or exposing Eric. It was about illuminating a pattern that affected countless older adults, about contributing to professional understanding that might help others. The next morning, Frank called Robert and agreed to participate in the panel. The decision felt right, not comfortable necessarily, but aligned with the person he was becoming. Someone who valued his own experience enough to share it, who recognized that vulnerability could be a strength rather than a weakness. As he prepared for the panel in the weeks that followed, Frank found himself reflecting on his journey with new clarity. The process of organizing his thoughts for public presentation forced him to articulate aspects of his experience he had previously left unexamined. He recognized that the water incident, dramatic as it was, represented only the visible manifestation of a pattern established years earlier. He saw how his own reluctance to establish boundaries, his confusion of providing with parenting, had contributed to the dynamic. Not that he deserved the mistreatment, never that, but that understanding, the full context, was necessary for genuine healing. Frank also acknowledged that while the break with Eric was painful, it had created space for new growth, new relationships, new aspects of himself to emerge. His friendship with Patricia was evolving into something deeper, characterized by mutual respect and genuine appreciation. His relationship with Lily had deepened through honesty rather than obligation. His participation in the chess club and other community activities had revealed aspects of his personality long submerged under the weight of filial duty. The day of the panel arrived with an unexpected sense of calm. Frank dressed carefully in a suit he had purchased specifically for the occasion, another small assertion of his new life. The conference was being held at a downtown hotel, and Robert had arranged transportation for all the panel participants. As Frank waited in the lobby of Riverside Gardens, Patricia appeared with a small gift box. "For courage," she said, pressing it into his hands. "Open it now." Inside was a tie pin in the shape of a chess piece, a knight. Frank smiled at the significance, the piece that moves in unexpected directions, that can jump over obstacles, that often surprises opponents. "Perfect," he said, fastening it to his tie. The small token carried outsized meaning, an acknowledgement of his journey, his strategic decisions, his unconventional moves to secure his freedom. The conference room was larger than Frank had anticipated, filled with professionals whose work intersected with elder care and protection. As he took his place on the panel alongside 4 other survivors of elder abuse, he felt a momentary flutter of anxiety. Then he looked out at the audience, people who had dedicated their careers to preventing exactly the kind of situation he had experienced, and found resolve replacing nervousness. When it came his turn to speak, Frank began simply, "Dignity isn't something that can be taken from you all at once. It's eroded gradually through small dismissals, tiny humiliations, incremental losses of autonomy. By the time someone throws water in your face at the dinner table for asking for more food, 1,000 smaller indignities have already prepared the ground." His voice grew stronger as he continued sharing the pattern of his experience, without bitterness, but with unflinching honesty. He described the financial manipulation, the emotional dismissals, the isolation tactics. He explained how reclaiming his autonomy had required systematic planning, securing finances, establishing legal protections, finding safe housing, building a support network. "The hardest part wasn't executing the plan," he concluded. "It was making the decision that I deserved better, that my dignity wasn't optional or negotiable, that my worth as a human being existed independently of my role as a father or provider." The audience listened intently, many taking notes. When the question period began, their queries were thoughtful, focused on understanding the experience rather than passing judgment or offering simplistic solutions. Frank answered with the same honesty he had brought to his initial statement, neither minimizing the pain nor exaggerating the triumph. After the panel concluded, several professionals approached Frank individually, thanking him for his insights, asking follow-up questions, sharing how his perspective would influence their practice. The experience was unexpectedly affirming, his suffering transformed into valuable knowledge, his vulnerability becoming a contribution rather than a liability. As he left the hotel with Robert and the other panelists, Frank felt a profound sense of completion. Not that his journey was over, he continued to build his new life day by day, but that a significant cycle had completed. From victim to survivor to advocate, from silenced to speaking, from isolated to connected. The station wagon waited in the hotel parking garage, ready to carry him back to Riverside Gardens, to his apartment overlooking the river, to the chess game scheduled with Lily the next day, to the dinner invitation he had extended to Patricia for the weekend. As Frank drove through the city streets, he passed near Eric's neighborhood, close enough to feel the pull of old patterns, old guilt, old questions about whether reconciliation might still be possible. But the pull was weaker now, counterbalanced by the gravitational force of his new life, his reclaimed selfhood. Forgiveness isn't the same as returning to abuse, Dorothy had said in group one day. You can release the anger without resubmitting to harm. Frank held this wisdom close as he continued toward home. His true home, not the place where he had been tolerated as a convenience or exploited as a resource, but the space he had created for himself, defined by dignity rather than duty, by choice rather than obligation. The setting sun gilded the river as he arrived at Riverside Gardens, casting the world in the same amber glow he had witnessed on his first evening there. But now the beauty wasn't just an external phenomenon to be observed. It resonated within him, reflecting an internal landscape equally transformed. The final drops from the glass of water thrown in his face had long since dried. In their place, a different kind of moisture occasionally appeared. Tears of genuine emotion, neither suppressed nor apologized for. Tears of grief for what had been lost. Tears of gratitude for what had been found. Tears of authenticity flowing from a heart no longer damned by fear or obligation. Frank Miller, father, grandfather, chess player, survivor, neighbor, friend, entered his home carrying with him all the selves he had reclaimed and all the possibilities that remained to be discovered. The door closed behind him, not as a barrier against the world, but as the threshold of a sanctuary he had earned through courage and persistence. Inside waited the peace Lily Patricia had given him on moving day. It had thrived under his care, producing several new blossoms that glowed white against the deep green leaves. Life continuing, growing, transforming, the simplest and most profound affirmation of all.